Clear Channel radio stations in Sioux City. We're going to look back and look ahead. The month of November is a month in which we honor veterans who served the United States of America in wars overseas. It is also a month when we start to look ahead to Christmas, and it is during the Christmas season that Western Iowa Tech Community College will be presenting a very special theatrical presentation that we'll be telling you about. A man who's involved with both of those aspects is Ralph Swain. He is the chair of the Humanities Department at Western Iowa Tech Community College. No stranger to this program, and we welcome back as our guest this week. Ralph, welcome to Spotlight on Siouxland. How are you?
Thank you, Paul. It's good to be back again.
Good to have you. Let's talk a little bit about something that you were involved in for Veterans Day this year. It was a special salute to Vietnam veterans, the 25th anniversary of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. You were part of a special ceremony. You are, of course, a Vietnam veteran. Tell us a little bit about that.
What they decided to do on this 25th anniversary of the completion and dedication of the memorial back in 1982 was to do a reading of the names, all 58,256 names that are currently on the wall. They've done it 2 other times, and you know, it's very possible because of the time that has gone by since the war and the age of the Vietnam veterans that this could be the last ceremony of its size. And so it was very moving. There were actually 6 days devoted. It started way back on Tuesday of the week of Veterans Day, which of course is November 11th officially. And on Tuesday, November 6th is when they had a poetry reading and music in tribute to the Vietnam era at the wall. The following day, on Wednesday, November 7th, is when they started reading the names. They asked volunteers from around the country to come to Washington, D.C. To read 30 names each in chronological order. As you may or may not know, the names on the wall are not alphabetical, but they are chronological on date of death, and that gives it certainly a lot more impact. Plus, it individualizes the personal experience of every soldier who gave their life by being able to see their names in rough chronological order of the date of death.
So you had a chance to get up there and read some names, and what was that like?
It was very solemn, very emotional. It was also exacerbated by the weather. It was cold and dreary, a little bit rainy, although the rain had stopped when I got up to the dais. Saturday at about 7:40 in the morning was when the 30 names that I was given to read came up. And the wall is actually 2 walls joined at an apex, and the center is a little over 10 feet tall, and then it slowly goes into the ground at both extremes. And they set the speakers and the microphones and the dais right up at the apex of the memorial. And you had to be there about an hour before to register, sign in, and then you simply got in line, and in chronological order of date of death, went up to the dais and very slowly read the 30 names. So yeah, it was very emotional because the gentleman ahead of me read the name of one of my best friends that died in Vietnam in 1969 when I was there. And interestingly, I had originally contacted the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund to request to go to Washington, D.C. and read my friend Ron McLean's name. And they sent me a letter and saying, would you like to come and read 30 names? And they got it in the proximity of where Ron was. As I said, the gentleman just ahead of me had read the deaths. It was 1969 June is when most of the soldiers died of the names that I read.
Mm. And what was it about your friend? This was someone that you knew that had...
I had gone to college at Colorado State University with Ron McLean. Interestingly enough, Ron was the son of James Stewart and Gloria Stewart, James Stewart, the movie actor. And
no kidding.
Yes, and I'll never forget, Ron and I were both enrolled in a political science program, and Ron had spent some volunteer time before going to Colorado State working on the USS Hope, which is a hospital ship, and a very wonderful, introspective and quite intelligent young man. And he and I would go to a restaurant, which is still in business east of Fort Collins, called the Charcoal Broiler, any number of nights, and just discuss politics and the future and what we plan to do in the future. And it was just really interesting. I had also visited him in Beverly Hills on one of my trips to California. And it was interesting. I walked up to the house in Beverly Hills, and who answered the door but Jimmy Stewart. And I told him that I came to visit Ron, and come on in, or have a seat, or Ron will be right down. I was just the epitome of Jimmy Stewart in real life, and very tall, distinguished young man, actor, who of course was spent his whole life in the military and later in the reserves.
He was a pilot during World War II, wasn't he?
He commanded a bomber group out of England, and prior to going to England during World War II, he was stationed for almost a year in Sioux City at the air base. So it's interesting how everything comes full circle, and Sioux City certainly has a role in the experiences of Jimmy Stewart. I was in the 3 Corps area of Vietnam in 1969, which is south of the Central Highlands, northwest of Saigon, in the area near Tan Son Nhut. Ron was with, I had enlisted in the Army. Ron had enlisted in the Marines. And we kind of lost track after basic training. I had no idea he was in Vietnam until he was killed. And I had picked up a service newspaper in country in Vietnam and read the announcement that he was ambushed near the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, leading a patrol of Marines, and it really floored me because, as I said, we had kind of lost communication once we joined the service, and because he was in one branch, I was in the other, and to read, sitting in this headquarters area down in the 3 Corps, and reading about Ron being killed and not knowing he was even in Vietnam the same year I was pretty hard. So my first trip to the wall, of course, was to get a rubbing of Ron's name. And we also got a Vietnam wall, constructed at Colorado State University, and got his name on the wall at Colorado State behind the Student Center. So it was very emotional going to Washington, D.C. for that and many other reasons. I also visited the Korean War and the World War II memorials, which were subsequent to the construction of the Vietnam War Memorial, and quite moving places. I hadn't been there before. And then, of course, I spent 2 grueling hours in the 4-story National Jewish Holocaust Museum, which isn't far from that area, and just a wrenching, very moving experience going through there. But the veterans gathered. There were speeches on Veterans Day, which was November 11th. Motorcycle parade. It's interesting, the Vietnam veterans are all to a great extent Harley drivers.
That doesn't come as much of a surprise.
The entire parade was Harleys, hundreds of them. There was no floats, there were no marching bands, there were color guards and Harley motorcycles. Coming down Constitution Avenue was quite different.
I'll bet. Our guest is Ralph Swain, who is a Vietnam veteran, also the chair of the Humanities Department at Western Iowa Tech Community College, and we'll get on to some of what is going on at WIT in a moment. But, I've known you for some time. You never told me the Jimmy Stewart story. I mean, how come that never came up?
I don't know. There's so many things in my life that, you don't always think of all the details. But
did you get to hang out with Jimmy Stewart, or
not with Jimmy Stewart? No, he was always
just there was just that one brief interaction.
Ron and I spent a lot of time together in Fort Collins, Colorado, going through college. That one trip to visit him at his home in Beverly Hills.
At what point did he tell you? Hey, by the way, I live in Beverly Hills, and my dad is Jimmy Stewart?
Well, there was kind of a word around, almost like a rumor, that he was related, because he didn't brag or talk about it. And I had him in several classes, and we just got to know each other. And I said, I always like to go to the horse's mouth. Is it true that your father's Jimmy? And yes. And, I should have figured it out, because he looks like him.
Really?
Yeah. Jimmy Stewart did come to Ron's graduation at CSU, and I have a photograph of Jimmy Stewart pinning. It was a press photo, pinning an award, honorary award pin on Ron's shoulder while he's in his mortarboard and his gown. But by then I had was back in New Jersey, because he graduated 1 year before I graduated, so I had already left for the East Coast.
And who knew? I guess I didn't know that Jimmy Stewart had lost a son in Vietnam. I mean, that's what a thing that must have been to live with.
It was really hard on them. And since I was still in Vietnam, of course, the funeral took place after they sent his body back, and I had sent a card to the Stewarts, and Gloria and James or Jimmy Stewart were very nice in sending me a thank you note back. I've got all that memorabilia in a frame, just as memory of a very, very dear friend of mine who was such a loss, because he was unassuming. He was you could hang around with him for months and months and he would never mention who his father was if you didn't know. So
that's great. What a great story. As far as the Vietnam veterans, there was a time they went through so much, not only what they went through overseas, but when they came back, they were not treated well initially. Fortunately, maybe 5-10 years after the fact, the movies came out, like Coming Home and The Deer Hunter, and there was some acknowledgement of, these guys were really caught in the middle of a cultural crossfire and a whole misguided war, if you will, if I may be so bold as to say that, or to interject that into this conversation. But how are they doing now? I mean, how are these guys doing, especially since there has been, the Vietnam Memorial went up before the World War II Memorial did. There seems, certainly, it doesn't make up for all that they went through, but is there maybe more of a sense that these guys are at peace with their legacy and how it has been acknowledged by their government and the people of this country?
Well, it's not so much the government as the doings of three individuals. We wouldn't have the Vietnam Veterans Memorial without Jan Scruggs, who, let's face it, the war ended for most of the military overseas in Vietnam in 1973, and then 2 years later in 75, the collapse of Saigon took place. The wall wasn't built until 82, and only through the tremendous efforts of a Vietnam veteran who was a corporal in the infantry by the name of Jan Scruggs, and he came back, did some studying at Yale, at one of the big Ivy League universities, and on post-traumatic stress disorder, and then realized he needed to do something that would help heal veterans. He took $2,800 out of his own money to begin the memorial fund, and then he said he would not have a single taxpayer penny put into the memorial. Now, this has never been done before.
And why was that?
Why did he want it that way?
Mm-hmm.
Because the country, to a great extent, did not welcome veterans home from Vietnam. That there was no attempt to build a memorial until he came up with the wherewithal to do it. And he figured the government wasn't going to do it, so he would do it. And he and 2 other Vietnam veterans got together and got some very powerful people, a couple of senators, including John Warner, and corporations and private individuals. They raised $8.5 million to build that wall without taxpayers' money. And it is because of the success of the Vietnam Memorial being able to come up with the funding without taxpayer money that we have, to a great extent, the Korean and the World War II, because they followed suit. And other than, of course, granting the park space, which is owned by the people. And those are very impressive memorials, and all 3 are unique, very different from each other. Yeah, it's an interesting story also of how the design came about. Highly criticized by different sectors. There were even racial undertones, because the architectural student who was selected was a Chinese American, and so an Asian. And the war was in Asia. Comments about the black granite, which really upset. Some of the detractors were saying that, the color of black, is a dishonor. It's a black scar in the earth. And I tell you, that ended real quickly when Brigadier General George Price jumped into the picture. He's the highest decorated African-American military person in our United States military. And he made the statement about that black is not a color of dishonor, and that he would not tolerate hearing that anymore. And so he was very instrumental in spearheading that. He's the one that helped set up the vet centers, by the way. He initiated the vet centers around the country.
And what's amazing about the granite, the black granite, is it is so, the finish of it is such that when you stand in front of that wall, and I have had the opportunity to do that when I lived in Washington, it reflects. So you see the faces. I mean, that's why there's so many famous pictures of the faces of people looking into that wall, looking at the name of a relative or a loved one who died in Vietnam. I think it is an amazing feature, and whether it was intentional or not, it turned out quite well, and I think is perfectly suited to the occasion.
It has a 3-dimensional effect, and it has a different effect at night lit up as opposed to daylight, as opposed to overcast skies. It's almost has a life of its own to it. The amazing thing, that phenomenon that has developed out of the Vietnam Memorial, are all the memorabilia left behind. That started when they were pouring the concrete footings, and a Vietnam veteran who was there and working on it threw a Purple Heart into the wet cement. And when that news got around, it seemed like once the wall was up and the public came, memorabilia started showing up at the wall. As of today, over 100,000 pieces of memorabilia have been collected by the National Park Service, and they're kept at a Smithsonian Institution facility nearby. Some of it on display, a lot of it, every piece is cataloged. Anything that does not deteriorate. So they don't collect roses and any other type of plants or things that would deteriorate, but everything else they collect. And 100,000 pieces right now.
Wow.
And by the way, the biggest thing left was a Harley Davidson motorcycle. Someone left it at the wall in remembrance for a fallen comrades. So
wow,
that's at the Smithsonian too.
That's interesting. so we kind of got, and you incorporated a lot of good information there. But how are the vets doing? I mean, how are they? Here we are. It's 2007, 25th anniversary of the Vietnam Wall going up. It has been nearly 35 years since the war ended. How are these guys doing?
Well, the ones that are still here, the ones that aren't struggling with various medical or psychological issues or Agent Orange cancer issues that unfortunately has affected many veterans. And this happens in many wars, the wounds and so forth. I think the veterans, by and large, have come to a point where they're much more at peace with themselves and the country's view of them. And I think the wall has done a lot for that, not to mention the traveling half-scale replica of the walls.
Which came to Siouxland, and we talked about that a few months ago.
It was here in South Sioux, and before that in Cherokee, Iowa. And two different walls, by the way. There's 3 different organizations that have moving walls. And, of course, many of the service clubs now are either commandeered or certainly heavily populated by Vietnam veterans, obviously because of the age of Korean and World War II. We see fewer and fewer of them joining. But in the early days, coming back from Vietnam, a very small percentage of Vietnam veterans joined the service clubs. There was a bit of a friction between those generations.
And why was that?
Well,
and I've seen that it's been written about.
It had to do with the whole general public perception of the war and stories, which many of them were true, but it wasn't certainly rule of the day. Atrocities such as My Lai and the anti-war flavor reflected on the veterans. And I can remember World War II vets saying, well, you guys didn't fight a war, we fought the war. Like they had no concept of what fighting a war in Vietnam was like. A guerrilla war, many times with the enemy not in uniform, no lines. There were no lines in Vietnam, not like in World War II. Or even Korea. But those veterans, not having experienced the Vietnam guerrilla the insurgency type of warfare, really did not understand it.
Kind of like what's going on in Iraq now.
Much more similar to the type of fighting in Iraq.
And in some ways, even worse, because you don't know at times who the enemy is.
Exactly. Yes. And the other side of it was that a lot of Vietnam veterans just wanted to forget. They wanted to isolate. They wanted to not join anything. They didn't even, in many cases, want anyone to know they were a Vietnam veteran. And it wasn't because of shame. It was because they were dealing with various demons that they had to deal with in their experiences. And or else, in many cases, just want to get on with their lives. And I would say the vast majority did not suffer tremendously from PTSD, were able to readjust and move on. But there wasn't any readjustment assistance. There was no readjustment assistance from the VA until years later when the vet centers were sent up. So it gravitated to either because of your own psychic and your own stability and mental stability and personality, you could adjust okay, or if you couldn't, God bless you, there was no help. That's the shame, is that those who needed it could not get help until the vet centers showed up. Today, we pretty much understand that. And so Iraq and Afghan war veterans, of course, have access to vet centers and other types of services if they need them.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, yes. The military still has this...
Problems.
Yes, they have the macho issue of, well, are you really tough? Are you really strong enough to handle it if you're showing psychological signs? And that's so much bull. War is something which we are not born into. It is something that is extremely traumatic, that creates tremendous anxiety when you're living in a place where at any minute there could be an attack or a surprise or rockets or IEDs or whatever, snipers. Imagine living that way for a minimum of 11 or 12 months. It wears on your nerves. It wears on your sleep. And expect someone to be able to just jump right back into business as usual, go make a buck.
And that happened after World War II.
Yeah. And
Korea.
And some people can do it and some can't. And you don't condemn those that can't. The best statement I've heard about this whole PTSD thing is that PTSD is a normal reaction to an abnormal experience, not the other way around. And for a long time...
By PTSD, you mean
post-traumatic stress disorder, for many years was considered an abnormality. And we know today it's normal.
Incredible.
It's a normal reaction. It affects... It's anything that is life-threatening to you, or if you experience something life-threatening or see something life-threatening. So women that are raped have the same reaction, the PTSD. If you see a murder, if your family member is murdered, it's a sudden ending of death or severe physical horror perpetrated on another individual or yourself that can create PTSD. We can go back to the writings of Herodotus, the first Greek historian that wrote about the Peloponnesian Wars, and we can tell in his writing that PTSD existed then, although they didn't know what to call it. But you can see it in his writings, the debility of the soldiers following a battle. And then you follow it to the Civil War, and it was called melancholia, or soldier's heart. And you would see it in the letters that the soldiers wrote to their family, their wives, and so forth. And they didn't know how to deal with it. And then you bring it up to World War I, and it was called battle fatigue. Shell shock was the biggest terminology used for PTSD. And World War II, they call it combat fatigue or battle fatigue.
So we're dealing with it much better these days.
Yeah.
Our guest is Ralph Swain, head of the Humanities Department at Western Iowa Tech Community College. He, as you've been hearing, is a Vietnam veteran. But we also want to talk about his activities at WIT, and we have about a minute and a half to talk about the event that's coming up at WIT this week. Tell us about it.
Well, some of your listeners may know that both you and I are involved in an organization, a nonprofit called the Great Plains Radio Theater Project. We've done a number of shows both at the Orpheum and at the Black Box Theater at WIT. And this coming Thursday, beginning Thursday, and then continuing Friday and Saturday at 7:30 at the Black Box Theater will be a Christmas show based upon the radio adaptation of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. An intermission to follow, and then concluding with a half-hour 1949 production of a show called A Miracle for Christmas. And this is the old-time radio on-stage broadcast with the commercial jingles sung by members of the WIT Choir.
And what are the show dates and what are the ticket prices?
Beginning Thursday night, 7:30, Friday night, 7:30. Unless you want a dinner Friday, it starts at 6 o'clock. Tickets for adults are $6 for the show and $3 for 12 and under. And if you want the dinner Friday night, it is $15 for adults and $8 for children. Saturday, show only at 7:30.
So Thursday, Friday, Saturday of this week, 7:30 at the Black Box Theater Space at WIT, Western Iowa Tech Community College.
Yes.
Ralph Swain, thanks for taking the time to join us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul.
And I am Paul Guggenheimer. Thanks for listening to this week's edition of Spotlight on Siouxland. We'll be back again next week. Until then, have a great week, everybody. So long for now.